everyone. It is a great pleasure to introduce today's speaker to you all. Julia Schwarzer is a postdoctoral researcher of the Research Foundation Flanders at KU Leuven, and her work centers on late antique history and religion in a broad sense. Last year, she defended her dissertation on Christian brotherhoods in Alexandria at the University of Würzburg, and a monograph on the same topic, I believe, will appear in a not too distant future. She has also worked on papyrology, especially on Coptic magical papyri, and on everyday religion and lay people in the ancient world. At the end of 2025, Julia started a new project on the Coptic reception of Julian the Apostate and identity formation in late antique and early Islamic Egypt. And today we are very fortunate to hear the first insights from that new project. Julia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marion, for this kind introduction, and thank you for having me. I would like to start the PowerPoint presentation, if that's possible, right now. Can you hear everything? Can you see everything all right?
We're seeing the display mode where we see the next folia and everything. So you may wish to switch.
Oh, yes.
The same thing, but it's, I think, one of the buttons on top that you could press.
Okay. Right now?
Perfect.
Great.
Thank you very much.
Oh, but now I cannot.
Take your time.
Good. Yeah, now it works.
Perfect.
Julian has proven a veritable lieu de mémoire, not only for modern scholars since at least the Age of Enlightenment, but also for near contemporaries. The retroactive recognition of his reign as a crucial milestone in the transformation of the classical world into a Christian one was not limited to Greek, Latin, or Syriac authors. In late antiquity, it is also attested for Coptic, by then an emerging literary language of the Egyptian Church, which in turn had been a driving force of this transfiguration. The earliest evidence for the reception of Julian in Coptic sources goes back to the Coptic Church History, or CCH. The Coptic Church History is a work which in its earliest recension stems from the second half of the 5th century. Its terminus postquem is the episcopate of the anti-Chalcedonian bishop, Timothy Alarus. Two distinct parts make up the Coptic Church History: a redrafted and extended version of the Historia Ecclesiastica by Eusebius, concluding with the persecutions under Decius, and a second, more original composition. Of interest for us is the latter part. Commencing with the episcopate of Peter, it continues to recount the history of the Alexandrian Church in the context of the Roman Empire until shortly after the Council of Chalcedon in 451. Its perspective is staunchly anti-Chalcedonian. From its focus on Alexandria and its ecclesiastical perspective, we can infer that the Coptic Church History might have been the product of the episcopal chancery of Alexandria. In Alberto Camplani's words, it formed part of the auto-representation of the Alexandrian bishopric. In its 4th and 5th chapter, the Coptic Church History recounts the rise, reign, and death of Julian. The account can be divided into 9 subchapters, which provide ample material for analysis. For this paper, I limit myself to an episode which at first glance appears to be much less spectacular than the provocative trash talk between Julian and Basil or the emperor's death by the lance of Mercurius. Instead, my focus is on an episode which contains a specifically Egyptian treatment of the reign of Julian: the discovery of the bones of Elisha and John the Baptist, and the eventual construction of a martyrium in their honor in Alexandria. Like other church histories, the Coptic Church History contains a sequence on Julian's attempt at rebuilding the temple in Jerusalem. What distinguishes the Coptic Church history from most other roughly contemporary historiographical accounts is the discovery of the relics of Elisha and John the Baptist and the ruins on the Temple Mount. In Matthew 24:2, Jesus had prophesied that there will not be left here one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. In his angry wish to prove the Galilean wrong, Julian initiated the re-erection of the temple. While the overseer and his men were doing their best from dawn till dusk, the hand of God destroys the fruits of their work every night. Finally, Jews informed Julian's men that the relics of the holy man are the reason for their vain efforts. To rid themselves of the bodies of the saints, Julian's men set fire to their tombs. With the tombs ablaze, the bodies, however, miraculously remain unscathed. This buys time for some brethren to intervene, bribe the comus, and rescue the relics to Alexandria. Here, Bishop Athanasius received them and places them in a baptistery. One day in his garden, while at table with his clerics and the leaders of the Christian Brotherhood of the Philoponoi, Athanasius expresses his wish to build a martyrium for the saints. This garden scene has an interesting Nachleben. More light will be shown on this below. Incidentally, Theophilus, the future bishop of Alexandria, had also been present at this occasion, serving Athanasius as his notarius. Later in the Coptic Church history, Theophilus, by then bishop, remembers the words of Athanasius and commissions a church in honor of John the Baptist in Athanasius's garden. Once placed in the martyrium, the bones perform many a miracle. The end of the entire episode marks the conclusion of Theophilus's episcopate in the Coptic Church history. Julian's spectacular failure at rebuilding the temple is implicitly contrasted with Theophilus's success in the construction and dedication of the martyrium of St. John and Elisha the prophet. The Coptic Church history explicitly anchors the building of the shrine in the context of Theophilus's anti-pagan campaign. As we shall see later, the contextualization of the building as part of Theophilus's struggle for supremacy over the urban landscape in the 4th century foreshadows this episode's afterlife in 6th century Coptic literature and beyond. Chapter 2: From History to Hagiography, or A Coptic Homily and a Mischievous Manuscript. The collection of Coptic manuscripts in the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin holds 5 sheets and 1 fragment, which the past database notes as De Ecclesia Triumphororum or Intres Pueros Babyloniae, a homily on the 3us ascribed to Theophilus of Alexandria. The manuscript carries the inventory number Chester Beatty Copt 820. In the following, I'll be referring to this manuscript as the Dublin manuscript. It is written in the Sahidic dialect and not internally dated. Based on its writing style, an upright majuscule, and its format, the manuscript might be dated to the 10th or 11th century. Until today, it remains unedited. To rectify this, I'm currently preparing the edition and translation of this manuscript. For the most part, and especially in the beginning, the Dublin manuscript appears to be a Sahidic parallel to the well-known Baharic version of the homily Intres Pueros Babyloniae, preserved in a manuscript kept at the Vatican Library, and the following referred to as the Vatican manuscript. Nothing very exciting, one might think. Yet, there is a significant point of divergence from the well-known Baharic version. On folio 3 of the Dublin manuscript, Julian the Apostate is prominently mentioned. I contend that the redactors of the Dublin manuscript adapted the sequence of the discovery of the bones of the Baptist and Athanasius' wish to build a martyrium from the Coptic Church history. Narratologically, this adaptation from the Julian sequence in the Coptic Church history precedes the main account of the homily Intres Pueros Babyloniae. This episode is absent from the well-known version of this homily preserved in the Vatican manuscript. It is a previously unknown reception of Julian in Coptic sources. It takes us back from the 5th century, when the Coptic Church History was composed, to the 6th or even the 7th century, when the homily on the three U's was compiled. The analysis of its content and relationship to the Coptic Church History has considerable implications for our understandings of the Coptic Church History and the general relationship between Coptic historiography and hagiography. Additionally, it is a unique possibility to study the reception of Julian in Coptic sources and even allows us to draw parallels to recent debates on trends in the reception of Julian in Syriac sources. The story of the three U's is treated in several works in Coptic literature, all of them pseudo-epigraphical. As mentioned above, the main witness for the homily falsely attributed to Theophilus of Alexandria is the Vatican Manuscript, a Bohairic codex which can be dated to between the second half of the 10th and the beginning of the 11th century. The homily essentially is a founding narrative or thesis of a shrine of the three U's in Alexandria. Its main objective is to explain a paradoxical situation: the absence of the saints' relics in the anti-Chalcedonian church built in their honor, in contrast with the Chalcedonian church boasting a relic of one of the three U's, but more on this later. According to the homily's outline, Theophilus had just concluded the building of the martyrium of the three saints and the one of Elisha and John the Baptist. He is devastated because he could not secure the bodies of the saints for his new foundation. In a nightly vision, Athanasius of Alexandria, the famous Alexandrian bishop, appears before him, accompanied by the three Hebrew youths. In another one, the three saints inform him how to fulfill his heart's desire. He is to send John Colobus, an Egyptian monk, to Babylon, where he is to find their bodies. However, as it turns out, the bodies of the saints must remain in Mesopotamia. The three youths themselves declare their intention to make up for this unfortunate circumstance by attending the consecration of the martyrium in person. During the night of the consecration, they sanctify the building with their spiritual presence in an apparition of sorts, which, as the homily insinuates, is in fact preferable to the mere presence of the relics. Unlike the Coptic Church History, the above-discussed pseudo-epigraphic Dublin manuscript of the Ecclesia Trium Puerorum is written from a first-person perspective. In contrast with the auctorial style of the historiographical narrative, Theophilus himself is the narrator in the homiletic composition. In the Vatican manuscript, Theophilus encounters Athanasius in a nightly vision and shares his plight with his famous predecessor. The latter then paves the way for him to directly communicate with the three saints, eventually solving his problem. In the Dublin manuscript, please excuse me for a second.
Hello.
Nobody ever rings at my door, but okay, it happened now. We will continue. So we were talking about the nightly vision. In the Vatican manuscript, Theophilus encounters Athanasius in a nightly vision and shares his plight with his famous predecessor. The latter then paves the way for him to directly communicate with the three saints, eventually solving the problem. In the Dublin manuscript, however, Athanasius does not make an appearance in a nightly vision, but only in Theophilus's memory, as he recalls the events that later led to the building of the shrine of Elisha and John the Baptist. These he had witnessed when serving Athanasius as notarius when but a young boy. The narrative in the Dublin manuscript follows the basic outline of the Coptic Church History, often omitting elements while condensing others and also adding new material. The focus here is shifted from the description of Julian's reign to the discovery of the relics, their translation to Alexandria, and the eventual building of the church or martyrium and its miracles. In the Dublin manuscript, it relates how Julian, in his highness of heart, attempted to incinerate the tombs of Elisha and John. The spectre of Julian's attempt to re-erect the temple as presented in the Coptic Church History apparently has become a moot point, as it is omitted, perhaps pointing to a date of composition before the Persian occupation of Palestine and subsequent efforts to raise up a new temple in the early 7th century. As in the Coptic Church History, pious men save the relics and bring them to Alexandria, even though fewer details are given. It is here where the Dublin manuscript deviates from the chronology of the Coptic Church History. While the Coptic Church History relates Julian's death separately from the discovery of the relics, the Dublin manuscript associates them very closely. As in the Coptic Church History, Athanasius rejoices greatly over the relics and keeps them safe. While the Coptic Church History relates their storage in a baptistery, the Dublin manuscript has him place them in a silver chest in the Martyrium of St. Mark. Next follows the episode in Athanasius' garden. Here the parallels between the Coptic Church History and the Dublin manuscript are especially close. This connection to the founding figure, Athanasius, albeit unhistorical, was apparently important to the redactors of our homily. In the remainder of the text, Theophilus expounds that Athanasius' successors could not fulfill his wish due to the persecution which arose through Arians and lawless emperors, a reference to the reign of Julian, but also Valens. Like the Coptic Church History, the second part of the inserted narrative in the Dublin manuscripts relates the actual building and consecration of the martyrium, but takes more liberties with its material than the first part. After the end of the description of the building episode on page 9, the narrative is again in line with the well-known version of the homily in the Vatican manuscript. The redactors of the Dublin manuscript condensed the narrative around Julian's reign from the Coptic Church History and focused on the establishment of the martyrium and its connection to the great founding figure of Athanasius. By associating Julian's death with the translatio of the relics to Alexandria, the redactors intensified a strategy already present in the Coptic Church History. While the Coptic Church History only associated Julian's reign with the discovery of the relics in a more general way, the Dublin manuscript specifically associates Julian's death with the translatio and the building of the shrine. Before turning to the interpretation in Sitz im Leben of the Dublin manuscript, some text-critical remarks are necessary. 3 of the 4 texts I will discuss now have already been introduced earlier. For the sake of clarity, I have created a tabular overview for you. In the commentary to his edition of the Coptic Church History, Tito Orlandi has argued that the narrative around the building of the martyrium of the Threeus can be attributed to a genuine work of Theophilus of Alexandria, most likely a homiletic oeuvre. This assessment prevails in scholarship. In the following, I'll be focusing on 2 of Orlandi's main arguments. First, he understands the statement, the entire narration of the building and how he found the bones and how he saw the miracles from the forerunner coming forth from them, as part of an enumeration of literary works attributed to Theophilus of Alexandria. Right before the statement about the discovery of the bones, we read, Theophilus, for his part, wrote some tractates of the faith, speaking in them about the conception of the Virgin, who has brought forth for us the true God, who teaches us to remain in the knowledge of the gospel at all times. Right after, we learn, he has written them for everyone who loves knowledge. At first glance, the Coptic Church History here insinuates that Theophilus himself was the author of our narrative. The statement, however, appears somewhat out of place. While grammatically correct, it is not connected to the previous sentence which had addressed Theophilus' authorship. For it to refer directly to it, we would expect another he wrote or he composed, in line with other enumerations of works by the bishop in the Coptic Church History. Another argument against understanding the narration of the discovery of the bones as a Theophilian work is anchored in the manuscript's layout, which Orlandi did not address in his edition. Red ink strokes before and after the phrase clearly separate the notes about the discovery of the bones from both preceding and succeeding text sections. The next passage's initial tau is stressed by ecthesis and colored, setting it further apart. Additionally, the list of works by the famed bishop is conspicuously short. Secondly, Orlandi has identified a narrative very similar to the Coptic Church History in manuscript BNF Copt 12914, a highly fragmented manuscript. In the following, I'll be referring to this manuscript as the Paris fragment. Unlike the Coptic Church History, this fragment relates the sequence of the discovery of the bones of the Baptist and Elisha and their translation to Alexandria from a first-person perspective. This characteristic led Orlandi to consider the Paris fragment a Theophilian work which served as the basis for the narrative around the relics of John in the Coptic Church History. Until now, the Paris fragment was the only witness for such a first-person account of the sequence surrounding the Baptist in Alexandria. When comparing my preliminary edition of the Dublin manuscript to the Paris fragment, one realizes that the Paris fragment is indeed very similar to the respective passage in the Dublin manuscript. In fact, it is largely identical. The Dublin manuscript preserves a more complete version of the narrative, which the Paris fragment only contains in part. The former offers precious contextual information, which is key for understanding the reception of the Coptic Church History and the role of Julian therein. What are the implications for Orlandi's theory, then? Is the Dublin manuscript another case in point, proving a homiletic Vorlage of the Coptic Church History, or are things more complicated? Three aspects must be considered, underscoring why the Dublin manuscript and with it the Paris fragment, A, most likely are not a genuine work by Theophilus, and B, very likely did not serve as Vorlage of the Coptic Church History. First, as established above, the Dublin manuscript clearly is dependent on the Coptic Church History. It follows the of the CCH, selectively adding and omitting new material. Secondly, a more solid point of departure for the relative dating of the Paris fragment and the Dublin manuscript vis-à-vis the Coptic Church History is the reference to the martyrium of St. Mark. While the Coptic Church History and Rufinus state that Athanasius placed the relics in a baptistry or the hollowed out place in the sacristy, respectively, the Paris fragment and the Dublin manuscript concur on him placing them in the sanctuary of Mark the Evangelist. Jean-Jacques Cou has convincingly argued that a martyrium of St. Mark in Alexandria did not exist until the 6th century. While some earlier sources attest his burial in Alexandria, references to a church of St. Mark before the 6th century reject a later state of affairs. The reference to a martyrium of the Evangelist in the Paris fragment and the Dublin manuscript serves as a terminus post quem. It gives us reason to assume their composition during or after the 6th century. Thus, they are later than the Coptic Church History and Rufinus. Finally, the narrative of the discovery of the bones of the Baptist and the building of the martyrium in the Dublin manuscript appear in a clearly pseudo-Theophilan context. The homily by Pseudo-Theophilus, as represented in the Vatican manuscript, essentially constitutes the founding narrative of an anti-Chalcedonian shrine of the Three Youths in Alexandria. As such, it rivals the Chalcedonian tradition as depicted in the Vita Altera of Sts. Cyrus and John. Contrary to Chalcedonians who boasted a hand of one of the Three Youths, the anti-Chalcedonians had no relic to show for. While the Chalcedonian tradition associates the foundation of the shrine with the 6th century Chalcedonian patriarch Apollinarius, the anti-Chalcedonian tradition, represented by the homily on the Three Youths, located in the later 4th or early 5th century, and ascribed it to Theophilus of Alexandria. With Jean Jascoux, we can assume that the Chalcedonian narrative probably lies closer to the historical truth. The homily ascribed to Theophilus and preserved in the Vatican and Dublin manuscripts thus represents a later, anti-Chalcedonian, alternative version of the originally Chalcedonian foundation of a shrine of the Three Youths in Alexandria. While it is not unlikely, even probable, that the tradition around the discovery of the bones of the Baptist arose in the milieu around Theophilus, the discovery of the episode featuring Julian and the establishment of the shrine of St. John in the Dublin manuscript renders the proposition that Theophilus himself composed the homily preserved in the Paris fragment improbable. It also inverts the conventionally assumed relationship between these two texts and the Coptic Church history. All evidence from the additional context provided by the more comprehensive Dublin manuscript and the observations of the paratextual elements of the Borgia manuscript preserving the Coptic Church history suggests not that the Coptic Church history is derived from the Paris fragment and the Dublin manuscript, but that both are dependent on the Coptic Church history. Chapter 3. Reimagining Julian. A key question, however, remains unanswered. What does Julian have to do with the Three Youths in the fiery furnace? Why did the homily's redactors choose to appropriate precisely this episode from the Coptic Church history? Two principal reasons should be considered, one practical, the other one programmatic. Between the 550s and 570s, Apollinarius, the Chalcedonian patriarch of Alexandria, founded a shrine in honor of the Three Youths, containing a hand that was considered to have belonged to one of the Three Youths. The homily on the Three Youths ascribed to Theophilus represents the anti-Chalcedonian claim of another martyrium dedicated to the three saints. It is a reaction to the historical fact of a Chalcedonian foundation. By ascribing the establishment of the shrine to Theophilus, the anti-Chalcedonian compilers removed it to a mystified past, when Christians increasingly appropriated public space in Alexandria. Thus, they harked back to an age during which the Alexandrian See approached the peak of its influence within the Roman Empire under Cyril, just before the dramatic shifts after the Council of Chalcedon in 451. The effects of Chalcedon marginalized the Egyptian church and eventually caused a schism between Chalcedonians and anti-Chalcedonians. More to the point, Theophilus was famous, if not notorious, for his building activities. In what his opponents called lithomania, he erected countless churches and shrines, among them the Church of St. John the Baptist, not, however, a shrine dedicated to the Three Youths. By associating the latter's construction with the famous sponsor of church buildings, opponent of paganism, and with the unquestionably historical, real act of foundation to establish the martyrium of St. John, anti-Chalcedonians enhanced the credibility of their claim. The Coptic Church history provided the founding narrative of the Shrine of St. John, which the Alexandrian tradition, and beginning with the Coptic Church history, is intimately connected to the reign of Julian, the pagan himself, an abysmal failure as a sponsor of sanctuaries. From Nebuchadnezzar to Justinian, Empire's Ruler in Sacred History. In his wonderful book on the churches of Alexandria, Jean Jascoux remarked on the Coptic tradition on Rufinus's account of the discovery of the relics of the Baptist. Elle s'est perpétuée pendant des siècles dans l'Église d'Égypte avec quelques variantes qui n'en altèrent pas le sens ni les objectifs originels. My discovery of the variation of the Coptic Church history in the Dublin manuscript challenges this assumption. I contend that the homily De Ecclesiatrium Puerorum, as preserved in the Dublin manuscript, not only takes us from the Babylonian exile to the time of Theophilus' supposed construction of the martyrium. Rather, it spans a chronological arc of more than 1,000 years, from the 6th century BC to the 6th century AD. In doing so, it reflects the perspective of a community aiming to construct its tradition in order to maintain cohesion under rulers perceived as apostates and infidels, a formative experience for anti-Chalcedonian Christians of Egypt. To better situate this wide chronological horizon, recalling the story of the eponymous saints of the Ecclesia Triumvirorum is useful. In the Old Testament book of Daniel, one of the three asks God for forgiveness for the transgressions of his people and laments the fact that they have to live under an impious ruler. The inclusion of the episode around the bones of the Baptist from the Coptic Church History into the homily on the three U's evokes the reigns of two impious rulers, namely Nebuchadnezzar II and Julian. The circumstances of its composition allow us to spin the thread of tradition further to envelop another lapsed ruler, Justinian, or one of his successors, who might have governed during the composition of the Dublin manuscript's version of Intres Pueros. The religious policies of Justin and his successor Justinian culminated in the separation of Chalcedonian and anti-Chalcedonian hierarchies in the East. This development also manifested itself in Egypt, with two parallel hierarchies, one headed by a Miaphysite or Theodosian, the other by a Chalcedonian or Malachite patriarch. With little improvements, the Miaphysite church in Egypt continued to be beleaguered until the tide turned with the Arab conquest, depriving Chalcedonians of their institutional support in the long run. To conclude, we began our exemplary study of Julian and Coptic sources with the Coptic Church History, a 5th century text and product of the self-representation of the patriarchate of Alexandria. As the narration of the translation of the relics of the Baptist and Elisha exemplifies, the Coptic Church History not only adapted Greek historiography, but also adapted it and interwove it with local accounts. It is this sequence that found its way into a hitherto unnoticed variation of a homily on the three U's in the fiery furnace. I have argued that this Dublin manuscript is a precious witness for the reception of the Coptic Church History in a homiletic context. The new evidence also allows us to reclassify the Paris fragment containing parts of the same sequence. In the light of the Dublin manuscript, the Paris fragment, contrary to previous scholarship, can be understood not as a Theophilian Vorlage of the Coptic Church History, but a pseudo-Theophilian adaptation of the same. The Dublin manuscript thus assumes a key role in the reconstruction of both the textual tradition of the Coptic Church History and the relationship between Coptic historiography and later homiletic literature in general. The redactors of the Dublin manuscript both liberally and creatively repurposed the Coptic Church History's episode on the translation of the relics to furnish a founding narrative for an anti-Chalcedonian church. The insertion of the translatio retrojects the 6th century foundation to the end of the 4th century, a golden age of the Alexandrian church, which saw Christians increasingly displace pagans from the public sphere. The redactors condensed the narrative from the Coptic Church History and thus parallel Julian's failure to re-erect the temple in Jerusalem with Theophilus's success in constructing the church of the three youths in Alexandria. Julian's role in the Dublin manuscripts allows the redactors to span a narrative arc from Nebuchadnezzar II over Julian to Justinian and his successors. This pious text is thus also a precious historical source. We have traced the reception of an historiographic text in the widest sense and its Nachleben in hagiography. While the first reactions to Julian focused on the engagement with his literary works, the 5th century church historians offered the first synthetic assessment of Julian's reign in the history of the church. These historical accounts in turn formed the basis for more detailed and imaginative accounts. The previously unknown adaptation of the Coptic Church History in the Dublin manuscript is exactly that. With every iteration of this process, less and less is left of the historical Julian, but there's ever more to be learned about the last pagan emperor as a literary Erinnerungsort of infidel rule and exposure to hostile state power, especially in a tradition long marginalized and silenced. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julia. That was absolutely fascinating. Right. Well, we have plenty of time for questions. So I would suggest that if you have one, you can raise your digital hand. If you're unable to speak, you can also write it in the chat and we can read it out. Perhaps maybe I can start. That's absolutely fascinating and really interesting to see a case where, well, I guess you would be appealing to Athanasius for orthodoxy and to Theophilus for buildings, for foundations of buildings. So is maybe just a question in terms of placing this more generally in the reception of Theophilus in this sort of in Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian circles. Do you have other parallels for this? You mentioned Theophilus is not that much as I think you suggested that not that much of his writings are preserved, but he's famous for his building foundations. So do you have other contexts where all these things come up?
So thank you so much for this question. So just about the list of Theophilus's works, I was just saying or pointing out that in the Coptic Church History, the list is just very short. It's just incomplete. Just to clarify that point. I am not an expert for the reception of Theophilus in later Coptic literature, but of course the phenomenon of the attribution of the later attribution of Coptic homiletic and other works to very well-known exponents of the church in the 4th and 5th century is a very prominent phenomenon. So I would assume that there are indeed many parallels.
Thank you. Alberto?
No, I'm afraid.
Thank you for your speech, and also congratulations for your capacity to understand the problem of texts and the context in which they are produced. I was fascinated by your hypothesis. I think that the question of the circulation of the Coptic Church is really interesting. I have here in my hand, probably you know it, an hymn, a Coptic hymn published by Tait and Kuhn, Oxford, in which it is said that it is an hymn dedicated to Mercurius, so you know, a central figure in Julian's experience. And it is said, I read only the 18th stanza, they declare to us in the 10th and 11th chapter of the history of the church, these two bishops, the miracles which you performed, you are, of course, Mercurius. Now, this means that there was a wide circulation of the Coptic Church history, and I share and I agree with you when you say that probably the homiletic expansion of the Hagic text is dependent on the Coptic history. I don't know if today Orlandi would repeat what he said in 1967. He has written a lot about Theophilus and also about the reception of Theophilus in the course of tradition. I think he made a little book published only on the internet about the relatio Theophili about Raphael, for example, 2 years ago. There is in his site a very personal way to publish things, but they are published. So you have the Coptic text, the translation, and some. And here it is clear for him that all those homilies are clearly plerophoric, that is, to be collocated in the context of the formation of the Miaphysite Church. Only two little questions. One should be, are there Philoponoi in the fragment, in the fragment of Paris, and also your fragment? This is the first question. The second is about the attribution to Timothy of the history of the church. I do not agree with Orlandi, so I said to him, I wrote this in the Festschrift for him. So, and because Timothy is appearing in the last pages of the church history, and he's transformed when you compare his figure with other compared to other historians. So I think that it was later, probably in the 6th century, that the church history was written. Of course, in line with Timothy. Second point is Mazzola and Van Nuffelen's discovery of the Vatican fragment of the Romans Julians in Syria. This is very interesting. So, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for your comments. Maybe first, my absolute favorite topic, the Christian Brotherhoods, the Philoponoi of Alexandria. So in fact, I was, of course, I know your article on the editorial activity of Christian Brotherhoods, and I worked quite a bit with it for my dissertation and scrutinized it a little bit in one chapter. And so what I did there is that I also compared manuscripts, or that I tried to find different versions of manuscripts and really see, or really try to trace Philoponoi or Christian Brotherhoods more generally there. And initially I ordered the Dublin manuscripts, or asked for the images, because I was departing from the Bohairic version in the Vatican manuscript, where we have Philoponoi, and they play a liturgical role in the liturgical song during their consecration of the martyrium of the Three Youths. So I was most disappointed when I looked at this manuscript and I could not find them. So Philoponoi do not appear in the Dublin manuscript. They do not appear in the fragment, in the Paris fragment. That's very unfortunate. At the same time, I found Julian in the manuscript, which really gave me the point of departure for my postdoctoral project. But I mean, it is very interesting to think about what it means that the Philoponoi are not present in the Dublin manuscript, and also not present in the Paris fragment. So theoretically they could make several appearances. So they could appear in the garden scene. We only have the garden scene preserved in the Dublin manuscript and the Paris fragment. So the later liturgical appearance, it's just not preserved, that the Vatican manuscript has is not preserved in the Dublin manuscript. So that's unfortunate. But the question then, of course, also, if my redefinition of the relationship between the Coptic Church History, the Paris fragment, and the Dublin manuscript holds true in the end, then of course this would render the inscription hypothesis, which was first brought forward by Edward Watts, I believe, not so plausible here, because then, of course, we would be not so much looking into at the insertion of a Coptic, of a Christian Brotherhood, but more of the falling out of a Christian Brotherhood from a narrative. And this is also an argument I make in my dissertation. So maybe it's even when you look for cases where they inscribe themselves, maybe you're more probable to find cases where they actually faded out of the tradition and of manuscript. But that's, of course, very interesting in itself. And, of course, the inscription hypothesis can hold true when we think about how the Christian Brotherhoods entered these narratives in the first place. So, of course, they must have made the case for themselves. They might have been very influential, they must have had the means to influence the original author. So in the end, it's still interesting to think about these things. But if the new relationship between the Coptic Church History, the Paris fragment, and the Dublin manuscript holds true, then this is again another point where we need to revise the existing inscription hypothesis when it comes to Christian Brotherhoods. Thank you so much.
Okay, Dan has a question.
Thank you very much, Julia, for the clear presentation of how these fragments relate to one another. It made me wonder how these texts and traditions fare in other languages, and maybe Syria could be of interest here for the relationship with the Coptic. Could you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you so much. So this is something I'd be looking into I hope to look into at the later stages of my project. But what I can say just for this little case study I did over the last few months in the Dublin manuscript, I can definitely say that looking at the Syriac tradition really enriches the way how we look at the Coptic tradition. And Alberto Camplani just mentioned the new article, well, comparatively recent article by Mariana Mazzola and Peter van Nuffelen, where they also proposed to date the Julian Romans a little bit later. This can be also very interesting or can inform also our dating of the Coptic material, as I have the impression that in earlier scholarship there was a bit the tendency to date them a little bit too early. This is something I have to look into more. Then what is also very interesting is if our homily was written in this controversy between Chalcedonians and anti-Chalcedonians, we can wonder why it is that Justinian or one of his successors actually not actively mentioned. Why is that the case? And here again, we can look at the Syriac tradition, for example, of the Julian Romans, where also current emperors are not mentioned, but recent scholarship has made, I think, a very compelling case for reading the Julian Romans in Syriac also within the horizon of the anti-Chalcedonian or Chalcedonian anti-Chalcedonian controversies. So there is no need. You could argue there is no need to refer to the emperor. Maybe it might have been dangerous as well. In any case, the references were clearly understood by the contemporaries, by the addressees of these texts.
Thank you very much. If I can follow up with another question, if I understand correctly, you are at the starting point with this. Yes. And you intend to develop it both in historiography and hagiography. Could you tell us a bit more about how this will possibly develop into hagiography? I'm interested, for instance, if you get in Egypt around your period, not necessarily in your interval, representations of Julian, I mean plastic ones.
Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your question. Well, I'm more or less done with this paper. Then comes the edition of the Dublin manuscript. Then, as I have identified, and I'm very glad that Alberto Camplani agrees with me on this, I believe that the Coptic Church history is really a key for our understanding of the reception of Julian and Coptic literature. So what I intend to do next is really look at the representation of Julian in the Coptic Church history, look in how far he worked with existing Greek, Latin, maybe even Syriac and other materials. Here, the publication by Trovato, of course, and the reception of Julian in later times will be very important. So I'll be spending quite some time with the Coptic Church history, and I think this is time well spent. Then, of course, you can slowly start to branch out and look at how Julian is perceived. Well, first in texts that are more well known, like the Historia Monarchorum in Egypt, the Apoptegmata Patrium, the letter of Ammon. We have a Greek fragment from Kase Ibrim mentioning Julian, and then of course it will be very interesting to look at different later Coptic texts, like the Panegyricus of Macarius of Tekoa, the life of Dioscorus of Alexandria, and other texts. But this is something that will really come at a later stage. But I already think that also considering Alberto Camplani's remark on the possible later dating of the Coptic Church history, it might already become relevant when I look at the sources of the Coptic Church history and how those were crafted for this historiographical work, and then look at later hagiographical receptions at a later stage.
Very nice. Looking forward to see how it develops. Thank you.
I think Alberto might want to pick up on this.
Yes, only a little note about there is an article by Perrin Pilette about Julian in the Arabic tradition.
History of Patriarchs. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Marion has a question as well.
Yes, thank you so much, Julia, for your talk. I was curious about the detail you shared as part of this garden scene, where Theophilus is standing up while the rest is eating and is set to serve as notarius. But he's not described as writing as such, but instead as keeping the speeches in his heart. And so I was just curious, how do you see this featuring? Is this in any way relevant for his image and for how these stories develop?
So I think we know of, if I'm not mistaken, we know of this idea that a future patriarch already has a close relationship to the previous patriarch, be it because they were taken in as children, or be it in the shape of an office or some kind of office kind of relation as notarius, is something that we find in more cases. So the question is, like, how old was Theophilus at this time? Maybe he was not even really able to write, and it was more really of the notarius was more, being notarius was more of a title. I could imagine that. I have to say, when he kept this formulation or this phrasing, he kept the words in his heart, that really also reminded me a little bit of Mary, of course, in the Gospel of Luke, and later he sort of becomes, well, in a way, like he carries Athanasius's wish further, which eventually will be born later on, so to speak. Yeah, but maybe it's really connected to his age at that time.
That's interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, but this is something to pick up for the edition. Yeah, thank you.
If there are no more questions, last chance. Then let us all thank Julia for a wonderful, fabulous presentation. And thank you all for joining us. Have a wonderful day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you,
everybody.
Thank you.